Hey, what's going on, guys? Today we are finally doing an update, a 1 month update on my sand waterfall aquarium here. Now, I apologize for not having something out sooner. It was always my intention to have at least like a 1 week or maybe even a 2 week at the latest update for you guys, but I just ran into more than a few issues with this tank that prevented me from making that video. If you guys have ever set up more than one fish tank before, you know that every tank is different, and this tank was definitely different for me. It was not easy, so I want to talk about what happened, the things that I did to kind of fix the problem and get us to this point here where I feel a little bit more comfortable with the progress that we've made. So we're getting closer. So let's talk about that. First, I should say that if you are seeing this tank for the first time, definitely go check out the setup video for this tank. I'll put it as the first link down in the description. It'll give you a lot better idea of sort of what we're looking at, but I'll also kind of explain parts and aspects of the tank as we go. Before we get started, I need fish suggestions. Okay, now the only requirements are that the fish are small. Okay, because we need to preserve the scale of this tank. The big mountains, they have to be really small fish. Okay, so that's the only requirement. Drop down in the comments. Also, let me know in the comments if you've done a sand waterfall and you kept shrimp with it, because I want to know, will the shrimp go through the waterfall and get shot out the top? My first thought is that that would be really cool to watch, but at the same time, like we don't want to be putting our shrimp through unnecessary stress and anything that could harm them, and it sounds to me like that would harm them. And you know, I also don't want PETA knocking down my door. So, but maybe they wouldn't go down there. I don't know. It might be worth an experiment. We'll just see. But if you've done it, also let me know. You guys will remember that the plants that are in this tank, it's all Monte Carlo. So it's all one plant. It's spread out on the substrate where it's tucked in, and then it's placed on the rocks as well, where it's not in any substrate, it's just kind of tucked into cracks. Monte Carlo is a plant that can attach to rocks and driftwood, as well as the substrate, of course, and it can do really well just like that, as long as you're giving the system some fertilizers. The plants that don't have access to the substrate need some fertilizers, so of course in this tank we're dosing a little bit. So if you compare this tank right here to the tank that we set up, you'll notice that plant positions are a little bit different. There's definitely more plants in the tank now. I filled in some more gaps, and I even ran a little experiment where I super glued some Monte Carlo onto the edge of this rock. I'd never done that before, and it turns out that that is a viable option for this plant. This piece that's super glued up here is doing pretty good, and that was a good thing to learn. So when you first set up a tank, the first couple of weeks, and in a lot of cases the first couple of months even, are super crucial for that ecosystem that you're trying to make. It's extremely fragile, and this is the period where you can certainly run into the bulk of your problems. And so this is also the period where you need to be the most proactive with things like water changes. Just all of your focus needs to be on your tank in trying to get it established and in a groove where the plants are growing and you're not adding too much waste, and there can be a lot of things. So no two tanks are alike. That goes back to what I said earlier. This tank had some issues. If we compare it to, like, let's say the desert tank, that tank had almost no problems. I had one little instance of algae in the first couple of weeks. I dealt with it with manual removal, stayed up on my water changes, never saw it again. So that's an example of a tank that went really well for me. Those are the tanks that I like. The tanks that go smoothly, don't require a ton of work, they get into their groove really quickly, and they're just set. So this tank hasn't done that. This has been the opposite, more or less, of the desert tank. And I can identify a couple of reasons why that is, but let's back up and let's go to, I think it was like week 1 of having this tank set up. So film the video for the setup, and then I think it had only been like 5 or 6 days before the first problem arose. And that first problem was a bacterial film on the top level of the water. The film arose most likely due to the decomposition of some of the plants, adding to the carbon pool in the aquarium. Remember, we're not feeding it yet, so there isn't a ton of carbon in there. I was actually kind of surprised to see a film like that, but pair that with the fact that we didn't have any surface water agitation, and the fact that we're also adding CO2, we're dropping the oxygen level down in the aquarium itself. What that's going to do is just create a prime environment for a surface film to come about. And so to get rid of that, one of the things that I did was create some more water surface agitation at the top of the water. So I added another pump into our little sump area in the back, and I pointed it over in this corner, and that did solve the problem. We got a little bit more flow in the tank, which is obviously something that we do want to have, and I didn't have set up right away. So that helped that problem, but with the addition of that, the water flow actually interacted with the sandfall on the right here and caused it to stop working. So just these little tweaks that I had to make the overall tank work, the list just went on and on and on. So from getting in here and just bumping rocks when I'm doing water changes, that could make one of the sand waterfalls stop working. I mean, everything that I did in this tank seemed to make it stop running as far as the sand falls go. So what I did with the water flow was I had to place a rock up here, and that was enough blockage of the flow to let this waterfall keep running. So we got the surface film gone with just a little bit more water movement, better circulation in the tank. But then the other problem that was happening simultaneously was the brown algae. So the brown algae started to show up around the same time as the film. They kind of coincided with one another. And this brown algae was growing on the Monte Carlo, it was growing down on the substrate, the rocks. It wasn't super bad because I got to it as fast as I could. So I got in there really carefully with the toothbrush, scrubbed the rocks a little bit, and tried to take as much off of the plants and surrounding areas as I could. Luckily, the brown algae is loosely attached, very loosely. You can just suck it up with a water change. And while I was dealing with this, at the same time, a lot of the Monte Carlo wasn't really looking that happy. Again, we didn't give it a lot of time to transition. In fact, we didn't give it any time. We took it straight from a pot that was grown out of the water and put it directly into the water. So this plant definitely needs to go through a transitional period before it starts to really take hold and grow strong in the aquarium like we want it to do. And that's, again, something that gives us a lot of beneficial properties and helps to balance our system. So knowing that we have to go through this transitional period, which can last a long time, it can take several weeks for it to happen. In fact, the tank's been set up for a month and we're still witnessing this plant go through a transition into a submerged growth form. During that period, it can be challenging. So having things like algae pop up like we were seeing is definitely associated with that. One mistake that I think a lot of people make is rushing into getting fish. So this tank, because I had issues with it, I wasn't going out and I wasn't getting fish and putting them in here, because the second you put fish in, even if it's a few, you need to put in fish food. And you start putting in fish food, you're introducing another variable that can increase the proliferation of algae and just kind of, in a way, reset what you're trying to do. So that's why we haven't added fish yet. I don't want to rush into it because I need to lock down this ecosystem and get it where it needs to be, get it stable before we add in fish and sort of cause a little bit of chaos, if that makes sense. When algae grows on plants, it's not good for the plants, it's not good for the environment. It slows down the plant's ability to grow, which is basically all we want to have happen. So that needed to stop. We needed to get rid of the algae. So by doing manual removal of that algae, cutting back on the fertilizers that I was putting into this tank, I was trying to use sort of like an average dose, but I cut that in half. That definitely helped, along with the manual removal and twice a week water changes of at least 50% while removing that algae has helped to reduce its presence and slow down its progression in the tank. Something else that I did was I altered the light period. When we set this tank up, again, we're using this Phoenix SE fixture on 24/7 mode. 24/7 mode basically goes from really low light, it ramps up to a high point, and then it goes back down again. And you have light on the tank for most of the day. It's just varying intensities and wavelengths. And typically, I don't use that mode on a tank, but because this one is out in the living room, I want to be able to look at the tank and have some light in it and enjoy it for all the times that I'm out here, which is in the morning, in the evening. So that was my reasoning behind that. But then we also have this accessory light right here, And this light was put on here primarily to light the back of the tank. Without that light, it's fairly dark back there, and it just enhances everything. But unfortunately, it's adding a lot of light to the tank, which can fuel our algae problem. So what I had to do was I had to reduce the intensity of it, which luckily I can do with a little controller, and I shortened the period that that light is on for. So the way that this is set up is that the CO2, which is back here in the left corner, turns on a couple of hours before this light hits its strongest intensity, which I think lasts for about 3 hours. So we get a ramp up of CO2, this light gets to max, and then this light turns on while this one is on max. So we have about a 3-hour period during the day where we have intense light and both of those lights on. Then this light turns off, and this light starts to ramp down. And when this light starts to ramp down, the CO2 turns off. So that might be kind of confusing, but just changing that, shortening that intense light period has helped as well. So those are the things that I've done to slow down the progression of the algae in this tank. If we take a closer look now at the tank right now, you'll notice that there is still some algae. I'm actually due for a water change when I'm done making this video. I might throw in some clips of me doing it previous times when the algae was a little bit worse, but it's just kind of an ongoing process that I expect will last probably another month. At that time, the Monte Carlo hopefully will be fully transitioned and growing strong in this tank. Something that I've also noticed in comparison to the other tank, the Super Blue Dream tank that has a lot of Monte Carlo in it, is the ability for that plant to attach to the rocks. So in the Super Blue Dream tank, the Monte Carlo is on Dragonstone, which is a clay, basically a hard clay, and it's very porous. So the Monte Carlo roots, the way I see this whole thing is that it has easier access for its microscopic root hairs to attach to that type of rock. Now the Suryu stone is a lot different, okay? It's a much harder rock, and it definitely doesn't have as much surface area to it, at least just by looking at the rock macroscopically. And so I haven't seen a level of attachment to this rock yet, but I still think it could be early on. I've never grown Monte Carlo attached to this type of rock, and that's why I'm thinking that there might be some differences. But if you've successfully grown it on this type of rock and got a really good attachment, let me know down in the comments. I don't want to make this video too long, guys. It's probably already a marathon at this point, but I do want to mention one last thing, and that is that the maintenance of these waterfalls, well, maybe maintenance isn't the best word, but the ability to keep them working properly is fairly difficult, only if you're in and out of the tank a lot. So if I just sit back and I don't do anything, as it is right now, both of these waterfalls work fine. I don't have to add sand, I don't have to move things around too much, but if I'm in the tank doing water changes, I bump something a little bit, it's very easy to disrupt them and get one to stop working. So I've had to just be really careful. And again, the goal is to not be in and out of this tank a lot, but during this first month or two, it's gonna be tough. I'm gonna have to be in and out of it and doing maintenance, but hopefully, you know, we're getting closer to that ultimate goal of getting this tank mature enough to where it can just kind of exist on its own and not need a ton of work. And yeah, it's been fun. It's definitely, I think it's my favorite tank that I've ever set up. So once we get all the kinks worked out, it's gonna be even better. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I want to remind you one more time to let me know what kind of fish we should put in this tank. We're getting super close. I don't want to do it too soon, but in the next few weeks, if things go according to plan, we'll definitely get there. So let me know down in the comments. Thanks again so much for watching, guys. If you're not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button. Hit that notification bell so you know when I upload the next video. You guys rock. We'll see you next time.